Okay, so we've been studying the life of Abraham. We've been going through the Bible chapter by chapter and verse by verse. We've been doing that for years. That's what we do because we want to get the whole counsel of God. We want to really know what this book says, and we want to really apply it into our lives. That's what we want. And sometimes when you're going through that, you're going to run into stuff that is not going to make sense, or it's going to feel like it's kind of out there, or it's going to be controversial. And we got up to chapter 21, and that was a couple weeks ago, and then I took a little break, and now we're going to do the second half of Genesis 21. Well, to give you a context, where are we in this story? When you jump right in here, it can look pretty harsh. It really can, because you have Abraham, and he has two sons. One is named Ishmael, that he had with his second wife, Hagar, and then he has Isaac, that he had with his first wife, Sarah. And there is a conflict in the house, and it's a big one. And the conflict has gotten so sharp that Sarah says, I can't live with this anymore. You got to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael. And this really is causing a problem. And it got so sharp that finally Abraham had to send Ishmael and Hagar away. Let's take a look. Genesis chapter 21, verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot, for she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Now, when you first look at this, it looks cruel. It looks, harsh. That here's Abraham just throwing this poor little kid out into the wilderness where he's basically going to die. I mean, you look at this and you think, I just don't know how this fits in to Abraham being a great man of God. I don't know how this fits into the Bible. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And if you really think about it, Abraham listened to Sarah once before, didn't he? I mean, it was Sarah's idea that he take Hagar in the first place. So listening to Sarah has not paid off for Abraham in the past. And here she is again saying, I've had it. I can't stand this situation anymore. You got to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael. I'm not going to put up with this. You see, the last time he listened to Sarah, he got himself into big trouble. That's what happened. He ended up with Ishmael. Now, Hagar had used the fact that she had a son to kind of one-up her situation with Sarah, and it created a conflict. It created a rivalry, and now you have Ishmael who's being rebellious. He's being mean to Isaac. Hagar is being a part of it, and it is creating a major problem in the family. This is not a small situation. Now, when you just jump into chapter 21, verse 14, you're jumping into the middle of a situation that's been going on for 20 years. That's something that we miss, roughly 20 years. See, when Isaac was born, Ishmael was about 13, maybe 14 years old. This is 3 to 4 years later, after Isaac is weaned and named the heir. Isaac is going to be the heir to everything that Abraham owns. And he didn't like this plan. He resented it. He was angry. You have Sarah's having an attitude. She's being angry. She's being unreasonable. But you have Ishmael doing the same thing. And Hagar's just, stirring it up. And it's creating a problem. Anybody who's ever had to deal with a blended family knows how this works. Knows how this works. When the ex is stirring up the kids against this and that, and you've got this triangulation going on all over the place, and stress and problems and fear, and it's just not a good situation. Not a good situation. And it distressed Abraham too. Why? Well, Ishmael's still his son. Still loves this boy. And he's confused too because he'd listened to Sarah once before. How many of you know it's a really bad idea to let somebody else's stress tell you what to do? This is a bad plan. And it had backfired on Abraham once before. And if we could learn anything else, we could learn that one lesson. Don't let somebody else's feelings tell you how you should act. Don't let somebody else's stress tell you how you should act. But you see, Abraham is smart. He's finally learned this. Now, he's been we've been reading about his life. He's over 100 years old at this point. He's learned a few things. He's learned that every single time he has allowed himself to be led by his emotions, particularly fear, he ends up in trouble. When he was afraid of what Sarah was saying, he ended up with Hagar. When he was afraid of the king of Egypt, he lied. When he was afraid of Abimelech, he has learned the hard way. Don't be led by your emotions. So what does he do? He goes to God, which is what he finally figured this out. I got this woman. She is upset. She's telling me what she thinks I ought to do. I'm not going to just listen to her. No offense against you, honey. I got to check with God. So he does. He goes and checks with God, and God says, well, you know what? I know it doesn't sound good. I know you don't like this idea, but follow what she's saying. She's right. You know why? Because I got a plan. I've had a plan all along, Abraham. It was my plan that Sarah was going to have a son, and he's the heir. It was your plan to go into Hagar and have Ishmael. That wasn't my plan. And my plans are always better than your plans. And now we're going to have a hard boundary here. Because we have got to move through my plan. Isaac is going to be your heir, not Ishmael. And you're going to have to deal with it if you truly trust me. That was God's leading. No matter how hard it may appear to you. Now you see, Ishmael didn't like this, but Ishmael had another path. See, God had promised, I'll take care of Ishmael. I know it was a bad choice, but I'm going to make it right for you, Abraham. I promise Ishmael will be a great nation too. Don't worry. I got his back. I got him covered. You'd already promised that. But Isaac is going to be your heir. That's how it's going to be. Now, whenever our plans don't line up with God's plans are always better no matter how we feel about it. That's what we need to get in our heads. We really need to get that in our heads. Now, let's think about this for a second. Ishmael could have gone along with God's plans because Abraham told him, Ishmael, I'm sorry, this isn't how it works. It is God's plan that Isaac is the heir and not you. I know that doesn't feel fair. I know you're angry about that, but it's God's plan. We need to follow God's plan because God's smarter than we are. But Ishmael was like, no way. Angry, mocking, mean. And it was creating bigger and bigger and bigger problems. Because the truth of the matter is, and I need you to get this, that Ishmael is mocking and critical of God. That's what's really going on here. And God isn't going to put up with that. God's not going to allow that. Now, here's the danger. You and I do it all the time. We do it all the time. Same thing. Think about it for a second. When you are mad at God or angry at God or just upset or critical, in your prayers. You're going, God, this situation in my life is intolerable. And it's your fault because you have not come through for me the way you're supposed to, the way I think you should. I have prayed about this situation. I have pleaded with you, and you haven't come through. You know what you're doing? You're being Ishmael. That's what you're doing. You're mocking, and you're saying to God, God, you're not smart enough to come through for me. Now think about it for a second. Think about the audacity of that statement. Is God smart enough to know when to intervene in your situation? Is he smart enough? That means that where you sit today, God has allowed. Ouch. But God, I'm divorced, and God allowed it. Ouch. I am divorced, and God allowed it. He didn't intervene. He didn't prevent it. He could have, but he didn't. I am not a rich man today because God didn't let me win the lottery. It's just the way it works. He could have. You think he knows what the next numbers are going to be? I assure you he does. But you see, we complain to God all the time and say, God, you have messed up. That's what we're really saying, instead of trusting him. Instead of trusting God. Now think about it for a second. Let's compare for a minute how Jonathan and David dealt with this. See, Jonathan was supposed to be the next king. His dad is king, King Saul. But God said, no, David's going to be the next king. And Jonathan went, yes, sir? You know why? Because Jonathan was a great man. He was a great man of God. He loved God. He served God. And if God said David's going to be king, then David's going to be king. See the difference? Ishmael wasn't doing that. God said, Isaac's going to be the next king. Not you, Ishmael. Sorry. And Ishmael was rebelling against that. It was causing problems. God's not going to put up with that. And you know what? We shouldn't either. Take a look at Titus chapter 3, verse 10. Look at this. If anyone is causing divisions among you, give a first and second warning. And after that, have nothing more to do with that person. For people like that have turned away from the truth. They are sinning, and they condemn themselves. That's pretty harsh, isn't it? And if you think about it for a minute, this young man is 17, 18, 19 years old. Abraham had given him a lot more than a first and a second warning. He'd been telling him for years, this is what God said is going to happen. This is God's plan. But there comes a certain point. You see, Abraham had been learning in his life not to be led by his emotions. And that's an example to you and I. We need to learn how not to be led by our emotions. We need to learn to be led by God's leading regardless of how we feel. That's what faith really, really is. Faith is understanding that God's ways are the best ways, regardless of our opinions, regardless of how we feel about it. Because you see, your emotions are going to pull you in a different direction. They are. Your opinions will change, and they're going to pull you in a different direction. But God doesn't change. God has a plan, and his plan is always the best plan. You see, if you're being led by your emotions, then you are automatically unstable. Why? Because your emotions are not based on being rational. They're not based on logic. They're based on chemistry. That's what your feelings are. And how many of you know your chemistry changes? I mean, seriously, I got up this morning, and I was down. And I got up this morning, and I'm just like this. Normally, that's Melissa. Okay? In other words, Melissa's like, give me the coffee. But she got up this morning, she's like this. I'm going, who are you? I mean, this is not you, and this is not me. I don't know how we got reversed in the middle of the night or something. But, I mean, I'm like this. But I get in here, and I start playing my instrument and worshiping God. And by the time I got to first message, I'm fired up because my emotions changed. But if I'd been led by my emotions, I wouldn't be here. We can't afford to be led by our emotions. We cannot afford to do that because they change. We've got to learn to evaluate our feelings based on how God leads us. That's what we need to learn to do. That's what Abraham is learning to do. And it can be difficult. He had a tough situation. He's got an unreasonable wife, and she was being unreasonable. She really, really was. She may have been as right as rain, and she was. But it's kind of like I've said before. You may have the right package, but the delivery, you're delivering it with a bazooka, so we've got a problem. And that's what was happening. And Abraham's upset. This is my son. Emotions were all over the place. But God said. And notice how quickly Abraham figures it out. It says, early in the morning, he got up and dealt with it. This is God's leading. I'm not going to listen to my emotions. I'm going to do what I need to do. Well, how do you know how to do that? The truth is, today, the primary way we know God's leading is from his word. If what you are feeling, if you're feeling led to go jump off a bridge, the Bible says suicide is wrong, so that's not God's leading. I've had someone actually look me in the eye and say, I was feeling led to cheat on my wife. Not by God. Led, sure, but not by God. Whatever leading you're feeling, it must be confirmed by God's word. If it's not from God. That's the first thing. The second thing is by prayer. Because sometimes you don't know whether or not you should take that job. It's not in, 1 Timothy chapter 12, verse 16 or whatever, Pat Marks, take that job. It's not there. So what do I do in a situation like that? I got to pray. I got to seek God's leading in prayer. And thirdly, I have got to seek God's leading with good counsel from other Christians who are strong in the faith, and they're not messed up with their emotions, and they're not in the situation. So between his word and prayer and good counsel, I can get God's leading. Instead of, well, I feel like doing this. Okay, feelings they're gonna mess you up. You can't trust your feelings. You can't. They change. They're arbitrary. They're all over the place. Think about how tough this was for Abraham. He's got to send his son away. Now, God did promise to take care of his son, but you know what? That's still hard. But God was leading. And we look at it, we think it's cruel, or we think it's to his ruin somehow that he was being thrown out of the house. But the truth of the matter is, listen to me, Ishmael was rebellious, he was insolent, and God knew the only way I'm going to reach through, I promised to make Ishmael a great nation. Not a big nation, great. Great means noble. And you can't do that if you're an insolent jerk. So I'm going to have to send you out, and you're going to have to face some hard times until you figure out I'm God and you're not. Ishmael's on a path, Abraham. Yes, he's your son, but he's on a path. And he needs to face some hard times in order to grow up. Send him out. He's going to fight you. He's going to be mad at you. He's not going to understand. It's going to hurt your feelings. And Hagar is going to hate you for it. Send him out. Because I have a path for him. And you're going to have to learn to trust me with that path. That's hard. That's hard. But you know what? I can't be led by my emotions is what Abraham figured out. Now think about this for a second. I used to be a high school teacher. And I'd get these young girls all the time. They're coming into my office because I'm Mr. Marks and everybody, I'm the band teacher. And it's kind of like a family. And they're always coming in there and they're crying their little eyes out because of some high school boy that they're dating. And I said, look, girls, here, learn a lesson. All high school teenage boys are idiots. Don't date them. Just don't. Wait till you're 18 and date somebody who's about 6 years older than you. Why? Because your average teenage male needs to get hit right between the eyes with a 2x4 called the hard knocks of life in order to figure it out. I know this because I was one. And that's what I needed. That's what I needed as a young man. I didn't like it back then, but that's what I needed. My boys had to figure that one out. When they joined the Navy, they found out in a real big hurry that those petty officers do not care about their whining. They don't. They're going to teach them real fast. You're going to learn to make your bed. I'm going to make you do it or I'll skin you. And they had to figure it out. They had to learn how to be responsible. It's hard. Abraham went, hey, I got my feelings on this, but Lord, I'm going to trust you. So he got up early and he dealt with it. And that's the first key we need to get. When it comes to having good relationships, God's leading, and it's always going to be confirmed by Scripture. What do we got to do? We got to act on it immediately, regardless of how we feel about it. So you're in a relationship with somebody. You're in a friendship. And you suddenly realize, wait a second. I'm hanging out more at a bar with you than you are with me at church. And we may have been friends for 15 years, but this relationship, you're mocking God. You're dragging me down. Whenever we talk about the Lord, you make fun of me. And you're supposed to be my friend? It's time for me to set a hard boundary here. I'm feeling led by God to say, that's enough of this. Hard boundary. Sometimes, in order to have good relationships, you have to be willing to set hard boundaries. That's what Abraham's learning. And when you have a leading from God to set a hard boundary, do it now. Or you will lose your resolve. You will. Guaranteed. Let's go on from there. Genesis 21, verse 22. It came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. And Abraham said, I'll swear to that. That's a good plan. I'll do that. No problem. Now, wait a second. When you first read this, and when I first read this, I went, this is like totally out in left field. I mean, we're just talking about throwing my kid out into the wilderness with my ex-wife and setting this hard boundary, and then you bring this up. I mean, it's almost like it's like an error. It's like a mistake. It's like it's so out in left field. You wonder, how can this be connected? I thought that. And most of the commentaries that I was reading made no comment about how this is connected. And it was really troubling me because I'm going, well, it's almost like you need a paragraph break there, or maybe a whole other message. I mean, I didn't know what to do with it. And as I was reading, I looked at this and I went, wait a minute. It says, at that time. There's the connection. Do you see it? What time? At the time he's throwing Ishmael out of his house, Abimelech shows up on his doorstep. That can't be a coincidence, can it? God's doing something here, and we need to figure out what it is. So I'm doing a little reading, trying to figure it out, and there's a pastor out there. His name is Sanger, William Sanger, and he said, I think this is about relationships. I mean, if you think about it, he's dealing with his wife, with his ex-wife, with his son, and all of this. He's learning to set hard boundaries, so God took an opportunity. God took an opportunity to teach Abraham something about having good personal relationships. The first lesson he's learning is how to set a strong boundary. The second, Abimelech is going to teach him. Take a look at this. At that time, right in the middle of all of this, somebody shows up on his doorstep. I think it's very possible that God led Abimelech to show up at exactly this time to reinforce to Abraham what he needed to learn about relationships. You see, if a relationship is dragging you away from God's leading, you need to confront that. But if a relationship is being threatened, you need to do something about it before it becomes dangerous. That's what Abimelech was doing. Abimelech is going, man, you are blessed by God. I like you, Abraham. I have invited you to stay in my country. But the first time we met wasn't really that great. I remember, do you? I mean, a couple of chapters ago here, you were lying to me about your wife. I almost slept with your wife. I mean, this was bad news. It's not a good way to start a friendship. You know what I'm saying? So Abimelech's thinking about this and scratching his head going, I know this guy knows the living God. I like him. I want to be friends, but I better be proactive. You lied to me once before, Abraham. I don't want you to lie to me again. I want you to promise me you're not going to do that anymore. You're not going to do that anymore. Because there's still a kind of a soreness in my life here. You see, in fact, I'm so worried about it, I want you to swear by God himself. Oh, that's pretty heavy. That's what I want you to do. I want you to be proactive about this. Now, it's kind of like the difference between figuring out you need to use sunscreen when you live in Phoenix and getting skin cancer. I mean, being proactive is just plain smart. But it takes some thinking through. And that's what's going on here. Now, you can see this in Romans chapter 14, verse 19. It says this, let us pursue the things, chase them down, the things which make for peace, and the things by which one may edify another. So, Abraham, you lied to me once before, but I want to have a good relationship with you, so I need to deal honestly with you. I'm worried about your temptation to lie. So I want you to promise me you're going to deal honestly with me. That's why Abraham, there's no hesitation. I'll swear to that. I learned my lesson too, man. I get it. I hurt your feelings, but I'll make sure we don't do that in the future. You know why? Because Abraham is smart enough to know his own shortcomings. You see that? He knows this about himself. You and I need to be wise about our own shortcomings just as well. And since I'm standing at the front, I'll pick on myself first. I know my shortcomings. Not all of them, because some of them trip me up still, and I'm going, oh, where did that come from? But most of them I know. If you don't know yours, I'll help you out. I'll tell you all about it. No, I'm just kidding. But here's the thing. I know my shortcomings. For example, when I first got married to Melissa, this was funny. I thought I was a phlegmatic personality. We did these personality tests. And I came up overwhelmingly cleric. And I went, oh, there's something wrong with this test. And Melissa went, no, there's not. You're as cleric as they come. Now, if you don't know what cleric is, the C in cleric stands for cold-blooded. You know what we are? We are visionary people. We're drivers. We're always getting somewhere. We're always thinking 5 steps ahead of where everybody else is. That's why my dad said when I was growing up, both oars in the water, son, because you're up here in the clouds somewhere. And that's where I am. And the problem is I'm always thinking, I'm already building a new building over there in my mind. Okay, I'm already ahead. And the problem is I can run right over top of your feelings when I'm doing that. Because you're right in the middle of something and I'm oblivious to it. Because I'm going, let's go! And you're going, I'm bleeding in the dust and you're leading me back here. Oh, you're hurting? Oh, sorry about that. Come on, let's go! That's my shortcoming. That's my personality. So you know what I do? I tell people that. I tell my staff that. Hey, guys, this is who I am. And if I miss it, if I hurt you, be proactive like Abimelech and come and catch me. Because I don't want to hurt you. But I know me. You need to know what your shortcomings are. And in your relationships, if you want to be healthy about them, you need to be upfront about that. You need to be upfront. That's what Abimelech is doing. And that's what Abraham is owning up to. And that's what you and I need to do. We need to be honest with people. We need to head these things off at the pass. You want to have good relationships, you need to think this stuff through. For example, I have staff members here that work for the church, work for me. And the thing is, I have some staff members that technology, they don't mix. You know what I mean? And we're all on technology, right? You know, everything's on Word or everything's on this or on computers or whatever, and they're just not there. Now, I've got 2 choices. If I want to have good relationships, I can say, listen, you learn how to deal with this or you're fired. That's one way to deal with it. Not a very healthy way, but that's one way to deal with it. Another way is to ignore it and pretend it's not a problem until it irritates me so much I blow up in your face. Can't you figure out how to turn this on? That's another way to deal with it. Not a very healthy way. Or we can follow God's leading that he's showing us here. And we can head it off at the pass. And I have sat down with certain staff members and said, hey, I know that you don't do too well with technology. I can see that. But you're a fabulous staff member. That's why you're on this staff, because you're really good with people. But I see that there's an issue here. So I'll tell you what. Let's head it off at the pass. Let's get you somebody that will help you get that technology under control. Let's work together on that. We got something's come up. There's a deadline on this, and I know you struggle with that. So why don't we get somebody to help you to make sure that that technology doesn't trip you up to make that deadline? That's called being proactive. That's called being wise. I learned it by messing up enough times and hurting enough people's feelings and not giving somebody the benefit of the doubt and not helping them and being a jerk as a boss. That's what I learned. Abraham's learning that too. You and I need to learn it. We need to get it in our heads that we need to be proactive. Take a look at Ephesians 4:24. There's got to be a spiritual renewal in your thoughts, in your attitudes. You've got to display a new nature. Because you're a new person. You're made in God's likeness. You're righteous. You're holy. You're true. So put away all falsehood. Be honest with each other. Tell your neighbor the truth. So I tell my staff, I'm going to run right over your feelings. Help me not to do that. I have staff members that are really, I'm going to mess up the technology. Okay, let's get somebody to help you. Let's be proactive in our relationships, and that's the key we need to get. That's what Abraham's learning. That's what you and I need to learn. God is leading us to be proactive in our relationships. Why? So we'll be an example of peace to the world. So be proactive, regardless of how you feel about it. Sometimes I don't want to be proactive. I want people to just figure it out. But people are that way with me too, and I wish they would give me some room, right? Do unto others as you have them do unto you. Remember that scripture? We don't like doing that very much, do we? Let's go on from there. Verse 25. So Abraham rebuked Abimelech. Well, that's pretty harsh. Because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I don't know who's done this thing. You did not tell me. Ooh. You ever been in a relationship like that? You're upset with somebody and they go, well, you didn't tell me. That's what Abimelech's doing. You didn't tell me. I didn't hear about it until today. So Abraham says, well, you should have known. If you really cared about, oh, wait a minute. That's not what he does. Oh, I caught you, didn't I? No, he gives him the benefit of the doubt. You see, Abraham's learned something. And you and I need to do the same thing. Someone says, I didn't know, give him the benefit of the doubt. That's what Abraham did. In fact, here's what he goes. He says, I'll set these 7 ewe lambs by the flock by themselves. And Abimelech says, what's the meaning of these lambs? And he said, verse 30, you take these lambs from my hand, and they'll be a witness that I have dug this well. Therefore, he called that place Beersheba. Beersheba means the well of 7. Because the 2 of them swore an oath there, thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army. They returned to the land of the Philistines, and Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. Now, when you look at this, what's going on is Abraham sees Abimelech being proactive to protect their relationship. And he thinks to himself, I better learn from this. God's obviously doing something because this is right in the middle of my family thing. I'm going to learn something about this. What do you want me to learn, God? You see, water in that day was a pretty big deal, wasn't it? I mean, where you had your wells. But you know what? The truth is, Abraham was a wealthy man. He had lots of wells. He had lots of servants. He could have let this little situation go. It's just a well. Who cares? And in fact, he had been ignoring it because he had not told Abimelech about it. That's what Abimelech says, right? You didn't tell me about it. You see, Abraham sees Abimelech being proactive. He's learning from that Ishmael situation, and he's got a choice. Now, think about this for a second. There are some things, they're just little things. We can let it go. You say something to me, it kind of hits me the wrong way. I'm going to let that go. In fact, you can look at this. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 11 says, the discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, which is what we should be, slow to anger, right? And it is his glory to overlook a transgression. In other words, you really need to think about what hill are you willing to die on. Because there's a lot of things that people are going to say to you that are going to annoy you. They're going to upset you. But is it a hill worth dying on? If it's not a hill worth dying on, that's discretion. Let it go. Let it go. But if it is a hill worth dying on, if it's a significant issue, and you cannot get over it, you need to go deal with it. But here's the problem. We are tempted not to. That's the temptation that Abraham was under here. He had not gone to Abimelech, had he? See, his temptation was to, but it was getting on his mind. He couldn't handle it. And once he realized, hey, I'm unable to let this go, I better go deal with it, he follows God's lead, and he goes and deals with it. But here's our temptation. Our temptation is to go, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to deal with conflict. So I'm not going to. So Doug has offended me. He said something that just bugged me. So I'll tell you about it. I won't talk to him. He should have known anyway. Right? And when I'm done talking to you, then I'll tell him. And then I'll tell him, I still haven't gotten to you. That's my temptation. That was Abraham's temptation. When he saw it, he went, no, that's the wrong thing to do. I'll go deal with the person that offended me. He didn't offend me. I'm just using it because he's sitting in the front. Now, the thing is, we don't do this. But God cares, listen, God cares about healthy relationships so much. Look what he says in Matthew 18, verse 15. It says this. Jesus is speaking. He says, listen, if another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the fault. If the other person listens and confesses it, you've won that person back. But if you're unsuccessful, take one or two others with you and go back again so that everything you say may be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. And if that person still refuses to listen, take your case to the church. And if the church decides you're right, but the other person won't accept it, treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. In other words, God cares so much about healthy relationships, he gives you a list of things to do in order to deal with it. Instead of going and talking to 12 people and not dealing with it and trying to pretend it's no big deal. If it is a big deal and you're having a problem with it, you need to go deal with it. First, you go to them privately. And if that doesn't work, you get 2 or 3 people that you trust to go with you and try and get it dealt with. And if that doesn't work, you pull us in. You pull the church in. Come talk to your pastors. And if that doesn't work, somebody's being Ishmael. And they need a hard boundary. You see how all these things connect? All these things connect. See, because ignoring a problem, guys, won't necessarily make it go away. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Burying your head in the sand just puts sand in your ears, and it doesn't help you. You know? Now, you got to do this in a godly way. You got to do this in a godly way. You got to do it with love, not criticism. That's why humility in private instead of gossip and out there destroying somebody's reputation without talking to them. You should never assume someone knows that they offended you. Look what Abimelech says. I did not know. You didn't tell me. Abraham could have said, you should have known. Those are your servants. You should have known. But he doesn't do that. He goes, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's clear the air. Let's solve this. Let's have a good relationship. That's what we're learning here. Now, I'm going to give you an example of how this happens and has happened even recently here at this church. Here at this church. Now, I'm going to speak up here for X number of minutes. 9 times out of 10, I'm going to say something you think I should have said a different way. Right? Or I might say something that offends you. It's going to happen. But unless you tell me, how am I going to know? So a few weeks back, I'm saying something, and I said something about my lovely wife. And I said something. I'm not even sure which thing I said. Okay? And I know that after the service, Melissa came to me and said, that was hysterical. Oh, it was the gum. That's what it was. I said that my wife would even recycle gum. That's what I said. And she thought it was funny. Didn't you think it was funny? And we're laughing about it. We went to lunch. I didn't think about it for 3 weeks. But then I hear the gossip chain. No kidding. It went to like 4 people before it finally got around to the office that somebody was offended for my wife because I said something that would malign her. And I went, okay, first of all, I know my wife wasn't offended or she would have told me. And secondly, she doesn't need your help to be offended. Okay, you don't need to be offended for her. Okay? She has to live with me. All right? So if I offend her, she'll deal with me. I don't need your help. But the problem was, instead of going and talking to me and saying, boy, that embarrassed me the way you talked about your wife, they went and told half a dozen other people about how insensitive I was to say such a thing out in front of everybody else. How is that making our relationship healthy? Because by the time it got back to me, it hurt my feelings. That's not good. And if you go to our 101 class, I make you promise in writing not to gossip. This is why. Matthew 18 is as clear as day. I offend you, you need to come talk to me. What does it say? Privately. Privately. This is why. And your assumption that I offended my wife was wrong. She wasn't offended at all. In fact, that encouraged you, didn't it? In fact, you don't know this, but that was an answer to her prayers. Did you know that? No, of course you didn't. She had just been praying, Lord, confirm to me. Lord, confirm to me that I'm doing the right thing, that I'm the right person to be helping with the finances of this church. And she's walking down the hallway. She sees a piece of gum. She picks it up because it was the right side up and the wrapper. She went, I'm not going to throw this away because that's her nature. And when I said that, it was a confirmation to her. God himself was saying, see, you're the right girl for the job because you noticed something as small as a piece of gum. And that's what this church needs. Praise the Lord. So somebody's offended and starts a gossip chain about something that's an answer to somebody else's prayer. You don't know. What are we learning here, friends?
Thank you.
Yeah. Say praise the Lord out there. Amen. Okay. We shouldn't assume these things, guys, because it doesn't make your relationships healthy. I'm not mad at whoever. I don't even know who you are because I heard it through the gossip chain. If it's you, just stop. And just know that, I love you. And I love my wife. And if it's you that we're saying those things, just stop. You don't need to come and say you're sorry to me. I don't want to hear. It's not important. What's important is that you learn. That's what's important to me. Just learn this. Just learn this. That's all I ask. You see, Abraham accepted Abimelech's answer, and I'm asking you to accept mine. I'm asking you to accept mine. And what he did is he said, I don't want to have any misunderstandings here, so I'm going to give you, we're going to make this right about the well. Give you some lambs that, hey, this is my well, made it right, solved the problem. You know how important this is, guys? Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 5 that your relationships with others are so important that you need to deal with them before you deal with me. Check it out. Verse 23. If you're standing before the altar in the temple and you're offering a sacrifice and you remember that someone has something against you, you leave the sacrifice and go deal with that. Why? Because if your relationships are messed up, if they're unhealthy, how can you have a healthy relationship with me? Go deal with those things. You need to forgive someone? Forgive them. You need to ask them to forgive you? Do it. How quickly did Abraham deal with the situation? Immediately, right now, early in the morning, got up, dealt with it. How quickly did he deal with it with Abimelech? Abimelech standing there on his doorstep, and he says, oh, I'm gonna tell you about this right now. Right now. That's godly. That's how we have good relationships. And that's the last key. You know what God's leading is? It's to be open and honest in our relationships so that we're an example of nobility with others. So be honest, no matter how scary or difficult that can be. It can be scary. It can be difficult. But if you follow God's leading to be honest and open, it makes you noble. Like Abraham. That's what God wants out of you and me. Let's pray.